The crystal goblets caught lamplight like trapped fireflies, wine running dark as river silt, while 11 members of the Walton family lifted their glasses in smug praise. In minutes, some would be choking, and others would be trampled. This is the story of how one enslaved stableman bent an entire Georgia estate to his will with nothing but patience, a bell, and a herd of horses. Joshua stood in the threshold between yard and kitchen, hands still from years of learning when to be invisible, watching the Waltons settle into their feast on a breathless September night. The hall clock tolled 7, each strike hanging in the wet air like a funeral note. Roast fat and magnolia drifted through the open sash beneath it, a whisper of iron and bitter wine no one at the table could taste yet. Before we ride deeper into this buried chapter, where are you watching from? What time is it there? Drop a comment, and if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe, because what you're about to hear has been hiding in ledgers and reward notices for over a century. The sun hung heavy over the Georgia countryside, casting long, oppressive shadows across the Walton estate. The land stretched for miles, an unforgiving expanse of cotton fields and sprawling oak trees, where the sounds of the working day were punctuated by the crack of whips and the clinking of chains. Joshua, a young, enslaved man, worked tirelessly in the stables, his hands calloused and his back aching from years of labor. Yet, in the stables, amidst the smell of hay and leather, he found solace. Here, he was not simply a slave. He was a keeper of creatures that understood his suffering. The horses, wild-eyed and strong, had always been his refuge. He spoke to them in whispers, brushing their coats, grooming them with the tenderness his soul so desperately craved. Joshua was born into a life of labor. His mother had been enslaved at the Walton estate, a woman who raised him with a quiet dignity, teaching him how to survive under the watchful eyes of those who considered him property. His father, a man who had once been a blacksmith, was sold when Joshua was just a boy. The pain of watching his father walk away, never to return, had been the first wound to his heart. But it was the loss of his younger brother, Ezekiel, that truly forged the man he was to become. Ezekiel had been Joshua's anchor. The two had spent their childhood together, playing in the fields when they were supposed to be working, stealing moments of joy in a world that had little to offer. But the Walton family, led by the cold and calculating Judge Walton, cared little for the bonds between siblings. They had decided that Ezekiel, strong and capable, was to be sold. The day they took him away, Joshua stood at the gates of the estate, his heart pounding in his chest, unable to do anything but watch his brother disappear into the distance. The pain of that day still burned deep within him, a searing ache that would not fade. Judge Walton was a man of wealth and status, and he wielded his power with cruelty. He was a figure of towering authority on the estate, a man who used his wealth to justify his treatment of those who served him. His hand was iron, his words were law, and his cruelty was unmatched. He had a penchant for violence, especially when it came to his slaves. His favored method of punishment was a simple one, a whipping post in the yard where he would make an example of those who dared to step out of line. And there was always someone to be made an example of. It was his way of reminding everyone of their place. Joshua had felt that punishment many times. He had learned early on that survival was about staying out of sight, about never drawing attention to oneself. It was in the silence that he found his peace, even as his body endured the brutalities of daily life. But there was something more stirring within him, a desire to escape, a desire to make the Walton family pay for the pain they had caused. It was a quiet fury that built with every lash, with every stolen moment. His days were spent in the stables, grooming the horses, cleaning their stalls, and caring for the equipment that was used to control them. The stables were a sanctuary, and it was here that Joshua learned to listen not just to the voices of the enslaved people who worked alongside him, but to the silent communication of the horses. He had a natural bond with them, an instinctive understanding of their moods and movements. In their eyes, he saw his own anger mirrored back at him. They, too, were creatures of bondage, bound by reins and commands, just as he was. Yet, there was a certain freedom in the horses. They were powerful, untamed, and though they were confined by the boundaries of the estate, they still held within them the ability to break free. Joshua would often stand in the stables, watching them as they moved in unison, their muscles rippling beneath their coats, their hooves pounding against the earth. In their strength, he found something to cling to, a sense of hope that one day, he too could break free. The Walton estate was a place where everything had its place, where power was held by the few, and suffering was the fate of the many. The family's wealth came from the land, from the cotton fields where men and women toiled under the harsh sun, their lives controlled by the whims of the Walton family. But Joshua had begun to see the cracks in the system. The Walton family's power was not as unbreakable as they thought. It was fragile, built on a foundation of fear and cruelty. And Joshua, with his quiet intelligence and growing resentment, was beginning to see how he might break it. It was on a humid evening in late summer, just before the harvest, that Joshua first overheard a conversation that would change the course of his life. He had been passing by the main house, a grand building that loomed over the estate like a symbol of oppression, when he overheard the voice of Mr. Walton in the distance. The conversation was about a new shipment of goods, a shipment that would include a few enslaved people to work the fields. As always, the Walton family viewed their slaves as mere property, something to be bought and sold like cattle. But this time, the conversation turned to something darker. "Get rid of the troublesome ones," Mr. Walton had said, his voice low and sharp. "We can't afford to have any rebellion on this estate. They need to know who's in charge." It was a simple statement, one that would have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But to Joshua, it was a declaration of war. He had long known the cruelty of the Walton family, but hearing those words, hearing the coldness with which they spoke of human lives, was the moment that ignited the fire of rebellion within him. He had endured enough. It was time to make them pay. Joshua's plan did not come to him all at once. It was not born in a fit of anger or impulsive rage. No, it was something that would take time, something that would require careful thought and patience. Joshua knew that revenge, when it came, would not be swift. It would be calculated, methodical, and inevitable. But for now, he stayed quiet. He bided his time, his thoughts focused on the horses, his only friends in a world of violence. The horses, like him, had been trained to obey, to follow commands without question. But Joshua knew something the Walton family didn't. There was power in submission, power in waiting for the right moment to strike. The night would come when Joshua would lead the horses to slaughter their masters. And when that moment came, it would not be a moment of anger, but a moment of justice. The horses would be the instruments of his revenge, and he would be the one to unleash them. But for now, Joshua worked in silence, his hands steady as he brushed the horses' coats, his heart burning with the quiet anticipation of what was to come. The days following the conversation Joshua overheard in the main house passed in a blur, each one more oppressive than the last. The heat of the summer clung to the earth, suffocating the air, and yet Joshua's mind remained sharp. He spent his days working with the horses, keeping to the routine that had been set for him. But each movement he made, each quiet interaction with the animals, was a small part of his larger plan. He had learned to live in silence, to let his thoughts remain hidden. But deep within, the desire for revenge simmered, growing stronger with every moment he spent under the oppressive watch of the Walton family. The moment of betrayal came quickly, though it wasn't the violent outburst Joshua had once imagined. No, it was something far more subtle, a quiet wound, one that cut deeply into his soul. It happened when Ezekiel, his brother, was sold away. Again, the first time had been bad enough, but now it was final. The Walton family had decided to send Ezekiel to a distant plantation, farther than even Joshua could reach. He had heard rumors about where he might go, somewhere deep in the swamp, where the work was grueling and the overseers were even worse. The news hit him like a blow to the chest. It wasn't just the loss of his brother. It was the feeling of helplessness, the knowledge that no matter what he did, he could not protect the people he loved. Ezekiel had been Joshua's anchor, his closest ally in the world. When Joshua had first been sold to the Walton estate, it was Ezekiel who had kept him sane, who had helped him find his place amidst the cruelty. But now, Ezekiel was gone, and Joshua was left with a void that seemed to grow larger with each passing day. The estate felt emptier, more suffocating. The loss of his brother felt like the last shred of hope had been taken away. That afternoon, Joshua was assigned to the stables once again, but his mind was elsewhere. His thoughts swirled with images of Ezekiel, of his face growing more distant with each passing year. He had no idea where his brother had gone, only that he would likely never see him again. The Walton family had ensured that. They had the power to tear families apart, to destroy any bond that might have existed. Joshua could feel that power in every crack of the whip, in every command shouted at him. The anger he had buried deep within him began to rise, a fire that could no longer be contained. But it wasn't just his brother's sale that drove Joshua to the edge. It was the way the Walton family continued to live without consequence, without remorse. Joshua had watched as they treated his fellow enslaved people as nothing more than tools to be used. The Walton family's cruelty was like an invisible weight, pressing down on everyone in the household. It was then that Joshua began to see his plan more clearly. He had to act. He could not wait any longer for justice to come through some other means. There was no justice here, no savior coming to rescue them. The only way out was through his own hands, but this time, it would not be through violence alone. He had learned to be patient, to wait for the right moment. He had trained with the horses, formed a bond with them that was unspoken yet powerful. The horses would be his tools, his allies in this rebellion. As Joshua stood in the stables, brushing down one of the horses, his thoughts began to crystallize. He knew what needed to be done. The Walton family would pay, not just for their cruelty to him, but for the suffering they had caused to so many others. The horses, strong and majestic, would be his instruments of justice. They would be the ones to carry out the vengeance that had been a long time coming. His eyes lingered on the horse in front of him, its coat gleaming in the dim light of the stable. There was a quiet understanding between them, an unspoken connection that went beyond the simple task of grooming. The horses had always been his refuge, his escape from the brutality of his world, and now they would be his vengeance. That evening, Joshua's resolve hardened. He could no longer remain passive, watching from the shadows. It was time to act. His mind raced with plans, with strategies. The Walton family would never see it coming. They would be caught off guard, their arrogance and cruelty blinding them to the very people they had abused for so long. The night would come soon enough. And when it did, Joshua would lead the horses to the very heart of the Walton family's power. He would not be the passive victim anymore. He would be the one who made them face the consequences of their actions, and in doing so, he would finally have the justice he had longed for, the justice he had earned. As he stood in the stable, his hand resting on the horse's neck, Joshua whispered to the animal, "Tonight, we change everything." The days turned into weeks, and Joshua's resolve deepened. The oppressive heat of summer began to give way to the damp, sticky air of early fall, but Joshua's mind remained fixated on the task ahead. His thoughts, once consumed by the constant weight of his daily suffering, now pulsed with a singular purpose. He was no longer just a slave in the stables. He was a man on a mission. The years of enduring the Walton family's cruelty had come to this moment. The quiet, deliberate planning of a rebellion that would shake their world to its core. Joshua's relationship with the horses had always been one of mutual respect, a bond forged over years of care and attention. But now, it was something more. He had spent countless hours in the stable, alone with them, training them, learning their habits, their strengths. He knew the horses better than anyone else. He could hear the rhythm of their hooves in his mind, feel their movements in his bones. And now, they would become instruments of vengeance. It was not just the horses that Joshua relied on for this plan. He had been careful, watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment. Over the past few weeks, he had begun to gather allies quietly, discreetly. Ruth, the head housemaid, had been the first to notice something was different about Joshua. She had always been sharp, her eyes missing nothing, her ears attuned to every whisper in the house. It was Ruth who first made the connection, who began to suspect that Joshua was plotting something, but instead of confronting him, she chose to wait and watch. She had suffered under the Walton family's cruelty for years. Just like Joshua, she had seen the way they treated the enslaved, how they broke spirits and took lives without a second thought. She knew that one day, the weight of their injustice would snap. Ruth quietly offered her support, though she never asked for specifics. She trusted Joshua's judgment. It was in the quiet moments in the kitchen, when the rest of the household slept, that Joshua and Ruth began to exchange glances and whispered words. There was no need for elaborate plans. Ruth was already a part of the plan, though she did not yet fully understand the scope of it. She had seen the toll the Walton family's cruelty had taken on Joshua, seen his silent suffering, and she could read the fire that burned behind his eyes. Thomas, the cook, was the next to join. His hands, though steady when preparing meals, trembled with suppressed anger whenever he heard the sounds of whips cracking or the cries of enslaved people being punished. Like Ruth, Thomas had learned to read the unspoken language of the house, the subtle cues, the glances, the changes in the air that signaled danger. One night, Joshua shared his plan with him. They spoke in hushed tones, their words barely rising above the crackling fire in the kitchen. Joshua had been meticulous in his planning, and now, with Thomas's help, the plan began to take shape. Joshua had learned how to use the estate to his advantage. He knew the patterns, the routines, the weaknesses of the Walton family. Mr. Walton, arrogant and self-assured, had a fondness for celebrating his birthday with a grand feast. It was during one of these celebrations, when the Walton family would be gathered in their opulent dining room, that Joshua would strike. The night would be a moment of chaos, when the horses, wild and untamed, would be unleashed. The plan was simple, but it required precision. The Walton family was used to their dominance, used to the quiet submission of their enslaved people. They would never suspect that the very people they oppressed would rise up against them. The horses would be the key. Joshua had spent hours in the stables, working with them, understanding their movements, training them to respond to his commands. He knew that once the gates were opened, the horses would charge, their power and fury unstoppable. They would trample everything in their path, and in the chaos, Joshua and his allies would make their escape. But it wasn't just about the horses. Joshua's mind had grown sharper over the years, and he knew that to truly bring justice, he needed to make sure that the Walton family would never recover from this blow. The estate would be in disarray, the family humiliated and destroyed, and the enslaved people would finally taste the freedom they had been denied for so long. As the day of the feast approached, Joshua's heart beat faster with each passing moment. He spent every spare second preparing, talking to Ruth and Thomas, making sure the horses were ready, and ensuring that his actions would remain undetected. Every step of the plan was calculated. There was no room for error. Joshua's thoughts were often filled with Ezekiel's face. The image of his brother's eyes haunted him. He remembered the day Ezekiel had been sold, his brother's last glance over his shoulder as he was taken away. The memory was a constant ache, one that Joshua would never forget. This revenge, this justice, was for Ezekiel. It was for all the people who had suffered under the Walton family's tyranny. And it was for himself, the man who had learned to survive, to wait, and to strike when the time was right. As the sun set on the Walton estate, the anticipation in Joshua's chest grew. Tonight, everything would change. The horses would run free, and with them, the promise of justice. The Walton family's reign of terror would come to an end. Joshua would no longer be the silent observer in the stables. Tonight, he would be the one who made them pay. The night had come. The estate, normally alive with the sounds of crickets and rustling leaves, was unnaturally still. A thick fog had rolled in from the nearby river, settling over the Walton family's grand house like a shroud. The air was damp and heavy, but to Joshua, it was perfect. The darkness was his ally. He could feel the electricity in the air, the anticipation building in his chest. Tonight, the Walton family would pay for their years of cruelty. Inside the grand house, the celebration was in full swing. Candles flickered on the long dining table, casting warm light on the faces of the Walton family. They sat with the same air of entitlement they always wore, smiling, laughing, oblivious to the storm that was about to descend upon them. The wine flowed freely, and Judge Walton, in his customary arrogance, raised his glass high to toast his own success, his voice booming with self-importance. "To another year of prosperity," Judge Walton declared, slurring slightly as he lifted his glass. The family echoed his sentiment, clinking their glasses together in hollow celebration. Joshua watched from the shadows, his eyes focused on the horses in the stable, just beyond the family's sight. He had spent weeks preparing them for this moment. They had been trained to respond to his quiet command, and now they were ready. The horses were powerful creatures, untamed in spirit, but under Joshua's guidance, they had become instruments of revenge. He could hear their restless movements through the walls, could feel the tension in their muscles as they sensed something was amiss. Ruth had been quietly working in the background, preparing the house for the chaos to come. She had ensured that the doors were unlocked, that the path to the stable was clear. She moved through the house like a shadow, checking on every detail with the precision of a seasoned conspirator. She had seen what the Walton family was capable of, and now she would help Joshua see that their cruelty would come to an end. Thomas, too, played his part. As the cook, he had been the one to prepare the food for the evening's feast. The wine reduction, the cream sauce, the vegetables, all of it had been carefully laced with poison. It was a subtle thing, not enough to be detected immediately, but potent enough to kill when consumed over time. The Walton family would die slowly, painfully, as a final lesson in the price of their cruelty. The moment had arrived. The Walton family was deep into their feast, the alcohol dulling their senses, the conversation growing louder and more chaotic as the night wore on. Joshua knew it was time. He had spent too many years in this place, too many nights with his mind filled with visions of revenge, and now it was finally here. He moved with quiet determination through the stables, his hand brushing the horses as he passed, his heart steady despite the storm raging inside him. "Tonight, we are free," Joshua whispered to the horses, his voice low and calm. The animals seemed to understand, their movements becoming more restless, more eager. They knew something was about to change. Joshua opened the stable door just a crack, enough to let the horses see the open path ahead. He could feel the energy of the animals shifting, as if they, too, were aware of their role in the reckoning that was about to unfold. With a single, practiced motion, he signaled them to move forward. The horses surged out of the stable, their hooves pounding the earth like a war drum. They galloped through the yard, their power and speed a blur in the dim light of the evening. The sound of their thunderous hooves reverberated through the estate, shaking the foundations of the Walton family's world. For a moment, the air was filled with nothing but the sound of the horses running, unstoppable and wild. Inside the house, the Walton family was in the middle of their feast, blissfully unaware of the chaos that was unfolding just outside their walls. Margaret Walton, the matriarch, was laughing at something one of her children had said, her wine glass lifted high in another toast. The air was thick with the smell of roasted meat and the sound of clinking cutlery, the perfect picture of wealth and privilege. But then, the horses appeared, charging through the estate like a living storm, their eyes wild and their breath heavy. The Walton family's laughter faltered, replaced by gasps of shock as the first horse galloped through the open door, its powerful hooves crashing into the fine wood of the dining room. The noise was deafening. Glasses shattered. The family screamed in terror as the horses tore through the room, their powerful bodies knocking furniture aside as they trampled anything in their path. The Walton family scrambled to escape, but it was too late. One by one, the horses moved through the room, their speed and strength a force of nature. Judge Walton, who had once ruled this estate with an iron fist, now lay face down on the table, his body crushed beneath the weight of his own arrogance. The family's screams were drowned out by the sound of the horses' hooves, each one a symbol of the revenge that had been long overdue. Joshua stood just outside the chaos, watching from the shadows. His heart pounded in his chest, but there was no fear, only satisfaction. The vengeance he had planned for so long was finally being realized. The Walton family's reign was over. The horses had done their part, and now, the rest would fall into place. Ruth and Thomas had already begun to move through the house, securing the estate, ensuring that the chaos would not be stopped. They worked quickly, silently, knowing that the Walton family's demise had to be complete. Joshua remained in the shadows, watching as the once proud estate was reduced to rubble, the Walton family's wealth and power crumbling beneath the hooves of the very creatures they had used to control. By the time the horses had finished their charge, the Walton family was no more. The house was in ruins, the family dead, their blood mingling with the wine and food they had once reveled in. Joshua's vengeance was complete, and the weight of it settled over him like a heavy fog. But even in the aftermath, as the estate lay in ruins, Joshua knew that this moment, this victory, was just the beginning. The Walton family's death was not just about revenge, it was about justice. The enslaved people who had once lived under their rule were now free, and the world would never be the same. The estate was a graveyard now. The once proud Walton mansion stood silent, its grand facade broken and battered, much like the family it had housed. The dining room, which had been filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses just hours before, now echoed with only the distant, fading screams of the past. The horses, their fury spent, had returned to the stable, their bodies glistening with sweat, their eyes calm once more. They had fulfilled their purpose. Now, they stood as quiet witnesses to the destruction they had wrought. Joshua stood on the edge of the estate, the night air cool against his skin. His heart was still racing, but there was no triumph, no victory to be savored. He had gotten his revenge, but in the aftermath, all that remained was a heavy silence that hung over him. The cruelty he had endured, the years of watching his people suffer at the hands of the Walton family, had finally culminated in this moment. But what came after? What happened now that the Walton family was gone, and the estate lay in ruins? Ruth and Thomas moved through the house, their steps careful, their eyes darting with the tension of what they had just witnessed. They had helped Joshua bring down the Walton family, but now, in the silence of their victory, the weight of the moment settled on them as well. There was no celebration in their hearts, just the cold realization that they had taken a life, and in doing so, had shattered the world they had known. "Is it done?" Ruth's voice was low, but it carried the weight of years of suffering, of silent endurance. She glanced around the once opulent room, now desecrated by the horse's charge. Her eyes held no joy, only the grim satisfaction of knowing that the Walton family's tyranny had ended. Joshua nodded, his gaze distant. "It's done," he said, though the words felt hollow in his mouth. "The horses have done their part. The rest is up to us." Thomas, the cook, stood nearby, his hands trembling as he wiped them on his apron. He had been with Joshua from the start, helping to prepare the poison that had taken its toll on the Walton family. But now, he too was looking around, taking in the damage, the carnage, the blood that stained the floor. There were no words for what had just happened, no way to take it all in. "We should go," Thomas said after a long pause. His voice was quiet, but there was a firmness to it, a recognition that the moment of revenge had passed, and now they needed to survive. "The law will come. They'll come looking for us." Joshua turned his gaze back toward the stables, his mind racing. He knew Thomas was right. The authorities would arrive soon, and when they did, there would be questions. Questions no one would be able to answer without putting themselves in danger. The estate was large, and the Walton family had many connections. But there was something else Joshua feared. It wasn't just the law, it was the guilt. The weight of what they had done would soon begin to settle in, and the knowledge that they had taken lives, even in the name of justice, would begin to gnaw at them. "We have to leave," Joshua said, his voice steadier now. He had been through too much to let fear hold him back. The Walton family was gone, but there was still work to be done. The other enslaved people on the estate were free now, but what did that freedom really mean? He turned toward Ruth and Thomas, the weight of the decision hanging in the air. "Tonight, we move. We leave this place, and we don't look back. We have to find safety, find a way to rebuild." Ruth's eyes softened, though the weariness was evident in the lines of her face. "Where will we go?" Anywhere but here," Joshua said, his mind already racing with possibilities. He knew the Underground Railroad ran through the region, and he had heard whispers of safe houses along the way. But the journey would be perilous, and the risk of being caught was high. Still, it was better than staying in a place that had been built on the blood of people like them. The three of them moved quickly through the estate, collecting what little they could carry: clothes, food, money. Joshua had kept a small stash of stolen coins, the remnants of the life he had once lived in servitude. He handed a few coins to Ruth and Thomas, the bare minimum they would need to survive on the road. The sound of horses' hooves filled the air as Joshua made his way to the stable, his thoughts racing. The Walton estate would be left behind in more ways than one. As he approached the horses, his heart skipped a beat. They were still in the stable, calm and collected, as though they were waiting for him. For a moment, he simply stood there, watching them, his breath steadying as he processed the enormity of what had just happened. The horses, the very creatures he had trained for this night, had done more than help him take revenge. They had given him and his people a chance at freedom. It was a quiet, unspoken gift, one that would echo through the generations. But even as Joshua stood in the stable, a shadow of doubt began to creep into his mind. What would happen to the others? What would happen to the 47 enslaved people who had lived under the Walton family's rule? Would they, too, rise up and take control of their fate? Or would the ripple of this night's events fade into silence? "We need to move," Joshua said finally, his voice resolute. "The world's changed, but it's not done with us yet." Ruth and Thomas nodded, and together, they led the horses out of the stable. Their escape had begun. The days following the fall of the Walton estate were heavy with uncertainty. Joshua, Ruth, and Thomas had fled under the cover of darkness, leaving behind the wreckage they had wrought. They had no time to mourn the destruction. Their eyes were fixed on the future, on the road ahead, where freedom was still an uncertain dream. But for now, they had done what was needed. The Walton family was no more, their estate reduced to ruins, and the enslaved people who had once lived in terror were free. The question that lingered, however, was what kind of freedom it would be. The journey was treacherous. The night was their only ally as they made their way through the woods and swamps, moving with the quiet stealth that had once been necessary for survival. Joshua had known from the beginning that the risk of being caught was high. The Walton family's connections ran deep, and the law would be looking for any trace of the people who had brought down their empire. But as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected began to take root within Joshua. It wasn't just the escape from the Walton estate that had been transformative. It was the realization that the rebellion they had set in motion was bigger than any single person. The silence of the enslaved community, their shared complicity, had carried them through the worst of times. The rebellion wasn't just Joshua's, it belonged to all of them, to Ruth, to Thomas, to everyone who had quietly refused to help their masters when they could have. It was a collective silence that had been broken only when the moment was right. And now, as they made their way through the woods, that silence had become the very thing that would protect them. Eventually, they reached a safe house run by abolitionists, a place where runaways could rest, recover, and plan their next steps. Joshua felt a strange sense of relief when he stepped inside. The warmth of the fire, the scent of cooked food, and the quiet bustle of other runaway slaves created a sense of normalcy that Joshua had never experienced. He was no longer in hiding. Here, among others who had also escaped the chains of slavery, he was not an anomaly. He was one of many, a part of a larger, living movement that was slowly but surely dismantling the system that had once bound them. But even as he rested, Joshua's mind was never at ease. He knew the Walton estate would be investigated, and the authorities would come looking for the ones responsible for the death of the family. He knew that every slaveholder in the region would be on high alert, paranoid about the possibility of their own slaves rising up. Joshua's rebellion had sparked something larger, a ripple that would grow into a tidal wave of resistance. In the months that followed, Joshua's name began to spread. Whispers of the slave who led the horses to slaughter circulated through the Underground Railroad, through plantations, and into the very halls of slaveholding families. Some saw him as a hero, a symbol of resistance, while others viewed him as a threat, a warning of what could happen when the enslaved people finally had enough. His story became a legend, a powerful myth of justice served through the most unlikely of instruments, horses. But Joshua had never intended to become a legend. His mission had been one of survival and justice. The Walton family had not just taken his brother Ezekiel. They had taken his dignity, his humanity, and every hope he had ever had for a future. The vengeance he exacted on them was not for glory. It was for the lives they had destroyed, his own, his family's, and the countless others who had suffered under the same yoke. As time passed, Joshua continued his journey north, though he never truly felt safe. The authorities were still hunting for the ones responsible for the deaths at the Walton estate. He had heard rumors that they were offering rewards for information, but nothing seemed to slow the growing momentum of the Underground Railroad. He and his allies had made it farther than most ever had, and Joshua began to believe that freedom might not just be a distant dream, but something he could reach with his own hands. However, even in his moments of peace, Joshua never forgot the consequences of what he had done. The Walton family was gone, but the violence of their deaths had left scars on the land, on the people, and on Joshua's soul. He had not just killed the family, he had killed the idea of them, the system that had allowed such cruelty to exist. But in doing so, he had also broken something inside of himself. The man who had once cared only for survival was now driven by something more, by a need for justice, a hunger to see the world changed, even at the cost of his own peace. The other enslaved people who had lived under the Walton family's rule were now free, but their lives, too, were marked by the aftermath of the rebellion. Some left the estate, moving on to the promise of freedom in the north. Others remained, unable or unwilling to leave the only life they had known. Joshua had tried to encourage them to follow, to seek a new life in freedom, but many stayed behind, fearing the unknown or too burdened by the weight of their past. But there were others who followed his example, who took the lessons of Joshua's rebellion to heart. Ruth, Thomas, and a few others made their way north with him, determined to build something better. They found work on farms, in factories, in whatever places would take them. They were no longer slaves, but they were still haunted by the ghosts of their past. The memory of the Walton estate, of the blood spilled and the lives lost, lingered with them. Joshua, though, found a quiet kind of peace in his new life. He lived in a small town in Ohio, a place where he could blend in and stay under the radar of those who might still be hunting him, but he never forgot. He never allowed himself to forget the power of what they had done, the lives they had taken, and the legacy they had left behind. He knew that the fight for freedom, for justice, was not over. It would never be over. But in his heart, he believed they had made a difference that would ripple through generations. As he sat by the fire one night, alone with his thoughts, Joshua looked out at the world he had helped change. The horses, in their way, had been his instruments of justice. But in the end, it was not the horses, nor the violence, that had brought him peace. It was the silence, the quiet, enduring silence of those who had refused to help, who had instead chosen to watch. They had given him the power to strike when the time was right. And for that, Joshua's legacy lived on, not in the violence of that fateful night, but in the generations of free men and women who had followed him, who had carried the torch of resistance in their hearts. His story was one of vengeance, yes, but also of redemption. And as the years passed, the world began to realize that the true power of Joshua's rebellion was not in the lives he had taken, but in the lives he had given back.